In this video, Karen accused me of stealing my own car, tricked a dumb cop into arresting me. Now my car is a wreck because he gave her the keys. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Doctor writes him the most passive-aggressive note, signing me off for 2 weeks instead of 2 days to teach him a lesson. And EM ends my engagement and gets me banned from a steakhouse all in one night. Karen accused me of stealing my own car, tricked a dumb cop into arresting me. Now my car is a wreck because he gave her the keys. I really don't care who believes this, but here's my story. I live in one of those middle-of-nowhere desert towns where almost everyone knows almost everyone and it's hot as hell, but dirt cheap to buy a home or land in. And it's not uncommon for old cars to last out here as they almost never rust and people keep fixing them. After high school, I worked my ass off at a local job to get my own place. I ended up buying a small plot of land with a trailer on it off of a local guy that decided he was going to move to Texas. And the guy also sold me his old Ford Escort prior to that. It was an okay first car, got me around well enough, still have it too. 10 years have gone by since then, and for a while I spent a lot of my time tinkering with an old 87 Monte Carlo that I bought super cheap as it was without an engine or transmission. I loved that car, as an older cousin of mine had one when I was a kid and I always wanted one of my own. I spent 2 years fixing up the one that I got with help from some friends and finished it in 2019. Since the engine was missing, I dropped in a junkyard Chevy 305 V8 that was connected to a rebuilt 4-speed automatic transmission with low miles from a totaled car. Then I painted it myself inside a friend's garage with a Harbor Freight sprayer and some GM black single-stage gloss paint and buffed it to a shine. And I finished it up with some gold Monte Carlo decals and some classic moon rims I bought from the local junkyard and polished it up. I also partially redid the interior by replacing the seats and put in a custom steering wheel. I'm not really a mechanic, but my friends all helped me, and online how-to videos on my smartphone really helped as well. The car was fun to drive and looked good, and I kept it in good order. That's until this mess went down. Now, I didn't really trust some of the local law enforcement out here before, and this gave me even more reason not to. A lot of the cops around here are barely qualified for the job. They're practically hired with a handshake and just told to play Doom for training. Granted though, many of them are really nice. The sheriff is even kind of a friend of mine, but he's really one of the only competent ones there. Most of the rest really don't do their jobs very well, especially whenever a new one gets hired on. Like a guy that went out of his way to move to my town just to be a cop. In this case, he was the nephew of the sheriff. He even brought his own Crown Vic with a loudspeaker to drive around town in. Let's call this guy NC for Nephew Cop since he was the sheriff's nephew. NC and I didn't know each other personally yet, but I was aware of him. He was dumb as a rock and high on his own ego. He was like Barney Fife and John Cena had an illegitimate son together because he was a tall, strong-looking man that was always giving people creepy looks and patrolled on foot up and down Main Street with a clipboard in hand and a big grin on his face. He also liked to publicly flex his muscles in front of people. One Saturday morning, I took my Monte Carlo out to meet a friend, but they ended up bailing because of a last-minute issue with their girlfriend. I thought, meh, no problem. I'll just get some fast food and go home. I went to the local burger place and got a meal to go. And as I was walking out, there was a lady outside looking over my car. She was bent over in a very short skirt, and not gonna lie, I enjoyed the view. People would stop here and there to ask me about my car and where I got it. I usually don't mind talking so long as they're polite. Though this woman ended up anything but. She was curvy and good looking while wearing a black miniskirt. I'm guessing early to mid-30s or so. Not really sure. I asked her if she liked my car. She stood up, took one look at me and snickered. I asked her what was so funny. To get an idea of what I looked like at the time, I was a skinny guy with a scraggly beard and was wearing a faded AC/DC t-shirt with the sleeves ripped off, along with worn-out cut-off denim shorts and flip-flops. I guess she figured I was poor or something, so she was probably judging my appearance. She looked me up and down in a very obvious way and then said, "There's no way this is your car. You couldn't possibly afford something this nice." Now, I have a tendency to get sarcastic or snide when people make assumptions about me, so I said back, "Oh, really, lady? The title is in my name, and these keys right here in my hand say I'm the owner too." The Karen just glared at me as I put the keys in the lock and began to open the door. I looked behind her and noticed a beige 90s Volvo with a missing headlight and had out-of-state plates on it parked not far from me. I put two and two together and laughed. "Let me guess, lady, that's your car over there?" She started to turn beet red. I laughed and said, "Oh, don't be ashamed. Those things aren't lookers, but they'll run forever." I figured this was over, but as I was opening my car door, I suddenly felt her nails digging into my shoulder. She was screeching so loud my ears were hurting. And before I could turn around, she kicked me between my legs from behind with a high-heeled shoe so hard I collapsed in agony. And true to my luck, NC drove right up because he'd heard her screeching from down the street during his noon patrol. As soon as NC was out of his car, the Karen ran to him crying and saying that I was a carjacker that was attempting to take her new car. I wasn't looking at either of them as I was on the ground wincing in a fetal position from the pain. The next thing I heard was NC yelling, "Put your hands behind your back," and then I was being pinned down by his knee on my spine and forcibly cuffed. I tried telling NC that I knew his uncle and can prove I'm the real owner of the car, but he called me white trash and told me to shut up. Then he picked my keys up off the ground and actually handed them to the Karen. Then he seemed to do a hero pose while she gave me a shit-eating grin. No matter what I said, NC wasn't listening to me because he fully believed her. And then I had to see Karen start up my car and drive off with it. My heart sank as I watched it sail down the road with her flipping me off. Then NC took me back to the sheriff's office. I'd hoped his uncle was in, but just my bad luck, he was out to lunch. So NC put me in the cell and told me to keep quiet. I was pissed. But I knew I wasn't going to make my situation any better, so I just waited. And during that time, NC kept giving me looks of contempt. At one time, he walked across the cell with a nightstick, grazing it against each bar like he was trying to intimidate me. At least an hour went by and the sheriff finally came in through the door, nursing a big gulp, but froze the second he saw me. "OP, what are you doing here?" he asked. I was about to speak when NC jumped in and said I caught this low-life creep trying to steal a lady's car, so I hauled him in. That's when I finally got my chance to speak and said, "Yeah, only it was my car, the one you know I spent so long fixing up." NC just rolled his eyes and said not to listen to me, but the sheriff silenced him and asked my full story. As I tried to tell it, NC was making dismissive looks and kept repeatedly interrupting until the sheriff told him to sit down and shut up. Then, when I was finally able to say everything that happened, he was furious. The sheriff laid into NC, who was cowering in a chair like a little boy, and saying that it indeed was my car, and he stupidly gave my keys to a thief that had assaulted me. NC started frantically apologizing and trying to say he was just trying to help. But the sheriff called him an idiot that just wanted to play hero by saving a damsel in distress, and now the whole department would be in hot water for his unlawful arrest and physical assault against me. Then he finally let me out of the cell. I got some ice for my crotch and got taken home. The sheriff and NC went back to the burger restaurant, but the Karen's car was no longer there. They got the CCTV footage from the camera the restaurant had looking outside. It caught everything minus the audio. The Karen came back riding piggyback with a guy on a motorcycle over a half hour from the time she left with my car. She blew him a kiss and then drove off in her Volvo. The sheriff scrambled everyone, even NC, to try and chase her down. But they couldn't find her as she'd already driven out of the county lines. Some phone calls were made to other departments to look for her, and I had to sit at home with an ice pack on my crotch all evening waiting for news on what happened. A couple days later, my car was found just a few miles out of town. The Karen had broken all of the windows with what I'm assuming was the tire iron and then put the car in neutral and let it coast down a deep rocky hill, which rolled it into the bottom of a ditch, which smashed the front end and warped the frame. It was completely totaled. I wanted to cry from the sound of metal grinding on rock as the tow truck pulled it back up. NC was there too, and he couldn't even look at me the entire time. My insurance also didn't want to cover the car, so the sheriff's office was made to pay me the value of my Monte Carlo instead, since NC let it happen, which was only about $5,000. Though that was honestly close to what I had into it since I did almost all the work by hand with the help of friends. NC also paid me another $2,000 for my trouble and said it was most of his savings. The Karen was caught at a motel a state over sometime later and arrested for soliciting prostitution and drug possession. Grand theft auto was just one of the many things she was charged with. I got on a video call just to see her in court and testify. She looked like a wreck the whole time because she knew she was screwed, and it wasn't long before she was pronounced guilty. She got 10 years behind bars with no possibility of parole. As for NC, the sheriff all but begged me not to sue him because he was his nephew and he promised his sister he'd look out for the guy. I'm not a sue-happy person, so I let it go, provided NC actually takes some sort of course on how to properly do his job. And so the incident was more or less rug swept, and NC was demoted to sitting at a desk all day answering phones, and they would be docking part of his pay until every penny was paid back. He's still regulated to desk duty half of the time these days, and he still avoids me anytime I'm near him. Arguably, he's a better cop now though because he mellowed out. As for me, it took some time, but with help, I finally located a replacement Monte Carlo project car with a clean title, and it was the same year too. I salvaged as many parts as I could from my old one and used it all in the build. The engine and transmission were still good, and somehow so were most of the base parts. And the sheriff personally came by to help my friends and I build a new car in his downtime. It took a year, but now I've got a fresh-looking Monte Carlo that looks just like my old one. You'd never know they weren't the same car. I've made sure to have better insurance this time around, and I'll be damned if I ever let a Karen near my car again. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Doctor writes him the most passive-aggressive note, signing me off for 2 weeks instead of 2 days to teach him a lesson. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I should note that I was a pretty reliable employee. I was never late. In fact, I often got in early and I rarely called in sick. At the time this happened, I had not called in sick for 9 months, and even then, the manager had sent me home. I had been up all night, swinging between burning hot and freezing cold, so I was obviously feverish, and I had been throwing up at both ends, shall we say. At one point, at about 2 a.m., I was on the toilet with my head in the sink, utterly miserable. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, I was lifting my head off the sink and it was 7 a.m. I was due to start work at 12 that day, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. So I called up the manager. Let's call the manager Steve. Steve was known for being a real a-hole. He never believed anyone who called in sick except his best buds, usually other managers, never lowly staff, but often called in sick himself. A lot of the time we knew it was just because he was hungover and not actually sick. The conversation went as follows. Me, hey Steve, sorry, I can't come in. I'm sick. Steve, with what? Me, I don't know. I think it might be the flu. I've been up all night being sick and I have a fever. Steve, don't be stupid. If you had the flu, you'd be completely knocked out. I need you in. Come in or you're fired. Me, I can't. I just told you I can't stop vomiting. I passed out. Steve, growling angrily, either come in or bring a doctor's note or you're fired. In the UK, you're legally allowed to self-certify for 5 days. This means you can tell your employer you're sick and you don't need a doctor's note. If you're sick for more than 5 days, you then need a note. It's also illegal to demand a doctor's note during the self-certify period. I knew this, but I was terrified. This was during the recession. I couldn't afford to lose my job. So I got myself dressed, almost passed out trying to do so, then trudged to the doctor's some 25-minute walk away. I ended up sitting in the doctor's office for a little over an hour, which for a walk-in was pretty good. I get in to see the doctor and she was furious at me for coming in. You're not supposed to come to the doctor's when you have a cold or flu, and of course I knew I should be able to self-certify. She told me as such, saying I shouldn't be here and should have stayed at home. I then explained what had happened with Steve and how he had threatened to fire me over this and I couldn't afford to lose my job. I was struggling as it was. My doctor turned her anger towards my manager. She asked if I got sick pay from the company, and I said yes. He wants a sick note, does he? The doctor says, okay, I'll give him a sick note. Now, my manager just wanted a note confirming I was sick, but instead, my doctor wrote something along the lines of this. My name has come to the surgery because manager name has insisted she come in spite of the fact that this is illegal and all employees are allowed to self-certify. Due to being forced to make this unnecessary and highly dangerous trip when the patient is ill, has a fever of 39 degrees, and also passed out in the waiting room, I'm signing my name off for 2 full weeks to recover. Had my name been allowed to self-certify as is the law, they might only have needed a few days, but due to straining themselves, they now require 2 full weeks. They're not to be permitted to work until date 2 weeks later. The doctor said she would have signed me off longer, but this was the longest she could do without requiring further evidence. So basically, instead of just being off for a few days, I was now signed off for a full 2 weeks, and I'd be paid for it. I went to my place of work, at which point one of the duty managers saw me and asked me what the heck I was doing here. Go home. I was obviously very unwell. I explained what happened. They agreed to help me downstairs to Steve's office and went with me inside. I handed Steve the note. He looked worried and tried to say I wasn't being serious about firing you. Well, gee, when you growled it down the phone, it sure sounded like it. The duty manager then declared that they were going to drive me home. It was clear Steve wanted to argue but had the sense to know he shouldn't. The duty manager then drove me home, made sure I was okay, then went back to work where they informed our union rep of what had happened. Steve had a disciplinary hearing where he was given a severe reprimand and a warning. Steve tried to argue he never said I'd be fired and I was lying and just decided to go to the doctors, but the duty manager said they heard him admit to it when he said to me that he really didn't mean it. I felt better after a few days and enjoyed my 2 weeks off fully paid and enjoyed the nice weather we had. Meanwhile, Steve was forced to work overtime because we were short-staffed. So thanks to the doctor, instead of being off for a few days, I ended up getting a nice 2-week paid vacation. And Steve was given a final warning, all because he insisted I get a doctor's note. EM ends my engagement and gets me banned from a steakhouse all in one night. Okay, so my girlfriend and I were really engaged to be engaged. We'd both agreed we wanted to get married, but I hadn't done the formal proposal yet because we wanted to meet each other's families first. Neither lived nearby. I always thought the old trope about meeting the in-laws being a big fiasco was a myth, both because I was younger and more naive then, and because I'm lucky to have easy parents. My girlfriend met them for a few hours. Once we were alone, just me and them, I told them my intentions and my mom asked, does she have any kids already? And my dad asked, does she have a good solid job? And they both asked, you really love her? And that was that. I had their full support for the marriage. I thought meeting her parents would be the same. Some grilling was to be expected, but as long as I was honest and respectful, it would all be fine. Relevant fact, they had my girlfriend when they were teenagers, by surprise, so now had a do-over daughter, their words, not mine, who was just 6 years old. My girlfriend and I made the trip up to their city and I met them for the first time over dinner at a steakhouse. It was pretty upscale and we'd scheduled the dinner for 8 p.m. so I was surprised to see they brought the kid along with them. I met everyone at once and the initial awkwardness settled once we'd sat down. We were making great small talk when the 6-year-old said she was thirsty. No big deal, right? Well, all of a sudden, Ellen starts screaming, "Water! Water! Water!" A waiter came rushing over to see what the commotion was and, without even making eye contact with the poor guy, Ellen went, "We've been here forever and no one's even gotten us any water. My daughter's been asking." We'd been sitting for about 15 or 20 minutes without service, but they were visibly behind, and there were no circumstances that would have warranted that shouting. I should have realized from how unfazed everyone else at the table was that I should be bracing myself for a long night, but I couldn't imagine what was to come at that point. The waiter rushed over with water and apologized for the delay, explaining a few very large parties had arrived all at once. The guy seemed sincere and quite affable, so I thought the water would just be an animality in an otherwise pleasant night. Then Ellen kicked into full gear. "We'll need a kid's menu," she informed the waiter. He said that they didn't have a kid's menu, but the chef could simplify most dishes. "What do you mean you don't have a kid's menu?" Ellen replied in total disbelief, as though he'd said they didn't have a fire exit. He explained they didn't get too many child visitors and that there were enough plain foods on the menu that no separate menu had ever been necessary. Ellen sighed dramatically and waved him away, literally without saying a word, waved him off from the table. I tried to give him an apologetic glance, but understandably, he didn't look back our way. I was so glad the poor guy left and didn't have to be subjected to her anymore. Meanwhile, she turned her attention on me, and I almost wished he'd come back. At least he was getting paid to be here. She was like, "So, you're a screenwriter?" And I explained, "Well, yes and no. I want to be, but it's hard to get a job in that field that you can support yourself on, so I'm working at a non-profit right now. There's a screenwriting component to the job though, so I'm really happy there." Ellen turned to her 6-year-old and went, "Hear that, hon? You want to be sure to snag a man who works for profit. Learn from this. It's not too late for you. I couldn't tell if she was trying to be funny or not, so I just let it pass, looking over to my girlfriend to see if she was even considering speaking up on my behalf. Nope. The waiter came back visibly nervous. That hurt because he was so relaxed and personable at the start of the meal. He asked if we'd like to hear the specials before we ordered, and Ellen said sure. Here's how that went. Waiter. First, we have a lightly seared strip stick. Ellen. Next. Waiter. Okay. Then we have a broiled leg of grass-fed. Ellen. Next. Waiter. We have a pasta primavera mixed with. Ellen. Next! And on until he'd gone through all 7 or 10 specials, even though she ultimately ordered off the menu a plain ribeye, well done. She tried to order her daughter the same, but the kid said she wanted plain mashed potatoes, so Ellen let her get mashed potatoes alone for dinner. Then she sent the waiter away. The rest of us hadn't even ordered yet, and everyone else just sat there like it was entirely normal. I waited for someone to say something, thinking it was more her older daughter, my girlfriend's place, or her husband's, but when no one did, I couldn't help myself. Was the one steak and potatoes going to be for all of us, or? My girlfriend explained in the tone used for a tourist violating a sacred local taboo. My mom always has the waiter put the kids' food in first, so it can get started right away. We'll order once the kitchen has hers. I thought she was joking. Since Ellen didn't just order her kids' food, she also ordered her own dinner too. So I laughed. Something funny? Ellen asked. Then I realized she was serious, and I shut up. Thankfully, her dad at least recognized that what was normal for them might not be as regular to me and tried to lighten the mood with a change of topic. But not even 10 minutes after we'd ordered, I guess technically 5 minutes after we'd ordered, 10 minutes after she and her daughter had ordered, Ellen started in again. Another table that had been there long before we were got a side order of mashed potatoes with their meal. Ellen threw a total conniption. She was sputtering so inaudibly that none of us could figure out what was wrong at first. Finally, she managed to flag down some busboy who barely spoke English and began laying into him like he just sideswiped her on the freeway. He kept trying to explain he wasn't a server and he could go get one, but she wouldn't stop to breathe long enough for him to find someone who could actually help. All the while, I kept looking at my girlfriend for signs of embarrassment, or at the very least, irritation, but you wouldn't have known if she was even hearing any of this. Our waiter came over, somehow still feigning a smile despite knowing what he was walking into, and Ellen actually goes, "Why did that table get mashed potatoes and ours haven't come yet?" The waiter kindly but concisely explained, "Well, ma'am, those people ordered potatoes before your party had placed their order." Ellen looks this man dead in the eye, finally, and says, "Well, it doesn't matter when they ordered it. My daughter is the youngest one here. Her food should come out first." You could tell the waiter was working hard to restrain himself at this point. He explained it was a first come, first served policy and age didn't help one way or the other. He offered to go check on the potatoes. Ellen agreed, or more specifically said, "Yeah, you better." But I was clocking him, and he went right back to his server station because we had only just ordered a few minutes ago. 3 or 5 more minutes passed, during which we could have no other discussion at the table except how awful this restaurant was, how hungry the poor baby was, who hadn't said a word about being hungry this whole time and was contently playing her loud iPad game without headphones, disturbing all the other diners around us, and how America has lost all respect for motherhood because it's just a me culture now. I chimed in. I'm with you on that last part. And to my utter shock, instead of laughing at my joke, my girlfriend seemed annoyed with me. So after a few minutes, the waiter comes back and says the potatoes will be out very soon. Ellen then goes and does something that, again, I thought was just a myth. She took 3 singles and a 5 out of her wallet and put them on the table in full view of the waiter. Then she took 1 single away and said, "Every table I see getting potatoes before us is a bill gone." I was absolutely mortified. The waiter, to his unending credit, just took a deep breath and said, "I don't have control over the order in which the kitchen fires tickets, but what I can tell you is it should be out any minute," and left without saying anything disparaging. I had been holding my tongue all night as well, in the name of my relationship, but once the tip hit the table, the $8 tip for a $100 plus bill on top of all else, I figured if my girlfriend was half the woman I thought that she was, then she wouldn't mind my speaking up at this point. If anything, she'd be supportive, right? So I scooted my chair back a bit and said, listen, I know what you're doing with the cash on the table, but that kind of thing makes me really uncomfortable and it's just not called for. Please put the money away or we can just continue this some other time. My girlfriend's dad spits back. What? How cheap do you have to be to not believe in tipping service workers? Before I could process whether he was serious or yanking my chain, Ellen shocked me with, no, you know what? You're right. This isn't necessary. I should have known better than to be relieved. She folded the bills back into her wallet, patiently waited for the next plate of mashed potatoes to be carried out, and when it wasn't delivered to us, it was a very common side dish at this place, a steakhouse, she went right up to a stranger's table and picked it up off their table. She half explained something about her daughter starving to death as she was walking away with the stranger's food, but unsurprisingly, that wasn't convincing enough for them. The old lady she took it from followed her right over to our table and tried to take it back. I was already searching for my coat tag in preparation to go, but a shoving match was beginning to unfold between Ellen and an elderly woman with a tennis ball walker, and far be it from me to sit through all that had happened only to leave just as the night was getting interesting. The elderly woman was like, give me back my potatoes. Who are you? And the poor little girl was like, Mommy, it's okay. Don't take someone else's potatoes. But it all fell on deaf ears. Ellen yelled at the old lady, how could you sit there and eat these when my daughter hasn't even been served yet? She's sitting here hungry, just a little girl, and you're over there stuffing your face. Come on. Other potatoes will be out any minute. And the old lady got to love her, was like, great. If they'll be out any minute, then what's the fucking problem? To which Ellen still found holier than thou ground, gasping, language, please. Finally, the waiter, and this time someone higher up as well, I think the manager, thank God, came over to separate them, as they had begun to raise their voices and cause a disturbance. Staff had already asked Ellen to turn down her daughter's iPad multiple times without heed, and I'm guessing the waiter informed management about the tip on the table stunt she pulled, because this was their last straw. They told us we were going to have to leave the restaurant, but we don't even have our food yet. Ellen complained at the guy. This was clearly not the manager's first rodeo. You can take the food that's already been served free of charge. Everything else will be canceled. Please leave immediately. The old lady didn't miss her chance to knock the potatoes right onto the floor, so we couldn't try to take them with us. Nothing else had been served yet, so we had to leave without any food. When my girlfriend and I were finally alone in our car, she said, can you believe that? And I said, not at all, and I really can't believe you didn't warn me. And she went, how could I have known about any of that? And confused, I asked, is she not usually like that? Even more confused than me, my girlfriend asked, who? Your mom. What's my mom got to do with the terrible service at that place? That was the beginning of the end of our relationship. The fact that she didn't see anything wrong with her mother's behavior and that I'd be marrying into that situation shook me too deep. We both dodged a bullet in more ways than one. In hindsight, we weren't right for each other, regardless of who her family was. Her mom saved us both a lot of time and heartache, helping me realize in one night what would have probably taken us years otherwise. Within a month, we'd moved into separate apartments and gone on a break that ended up lasting forever. I'm not sorry I won't see you again, Ellen. I'm sorry any waitstaff ever will, though.